Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. I'm a huge fan of this simple yet elegant technique. Not only does it accent seam lines and edges, but it can camouflage areas that aren't perfectly matched, common when working with hand-woven fabrics. First, I'd like to explain the difference between piping and cording. Vogue sewing is my go-to volume for all things sewing. I have a number of different editions, and the blue book is my favorite. According to Vogue sewing, the difference between piping and cording is the thickness of the filler. I like to define piping as a bias strip that's been folded in half and sandwiched in a seam or outer perimeter of a garment. And I define cording as stuffed piping. Again, using a bias strip, that bias is folded over some sort of stuffing or filler that creates a smooth, round look to the trim. Now, before we get into the actual construction and application of piping or cording, let's look at some of the ways I've used piping and cording. This hand-woven and hand-dyed jacket I made a few years ago, and the edge, the perimeter edge of this jacket, all the way around the collar, is trimmed with a very soft cording. This hand-woven coat, also featuring hand-dyed warps, also features cording that's stuffed with something a little bit heavier all the way around the perimeter and the collar. And in addition, I have trimmed the raglan sleeve to really define that with the same cording. And I did that because it was really difficult to get any of this area to match up. And by creating this fence line, it really separated the grain line that comes in from this way and the grain line that comes in from this way. The vest that I'm wearing, sort of vintage and maybe 1995, isn't actually hand-woven fabric. Actually, it is hand-woven fabric, but I didn't weave it. I found it at a very high-end fabric store in the remnant section, and I bought what was left on the bolt. It still had some of the warp attached, which was really a fun find for me. Anyway, I used that same cording technique as the perimeter on the vest, and the reason I like to do this is because when you line something to the edge, that cording acts like a fence wall so that the lining doesn't peek around the corner. You get a really crisp finish to your edge. This is also a very early vintage piece of mine. As a fun story behind it, I made this piece when I was sort of quarantined at home with two toddlers who had chicken pox, one right after the other. So for a month I spent, it was a cold January, with two toddlers, telling them not to scratch, and I made this vest, which took me about a month. It's a lot of handwork involved. And the thing about this vest is that it's completely reversible. There are reversible bound buttonholes on the other side, and the whole vest can be reversed and be a completely different look. So for our purposes, I want to point out that not only does this vest have hand-woven bias cut piping, but when it flips over, I have nested inside of that a bias cut linen piping. So I've staggered the two, and that gives a really nice edge to the reverse side of this vest. And this coat I call my Ikat Swing Coat. It is a hand-dyed warp, like I showed you before, which kind of gives this sort of ombre effect up the length of the jacket. Now this coat has a collar, a shawl collar, which is what I will be putting on the Harris tweed jacket that you see on the dress form behind me. That's one of the ones that I've been making in this latest series of videos. So that's going to get this collar. But on this particular coat, I put cording right up that seam line to help to differentiate again between the sort of opposing grain lines. So, and the fact that the color might not line up perfectly. So that cording really helped to define those areas. This walking vest was particularly challenging. I didn't have a lot of fabric to work with, and I was most focused on getting the plaid to match up. It was impossible to find the right amount of fabric to get the undercollar and band to also match with it. So I came up with the idea of cutting the undercollar and band sections on the diagonal, or bias if you will, and I did stabilize it on grain so it wouldn't do anything untoward when I attached it to the garment. But to really create a fence wall between the diagonal grain line and the vertical and horizontal grain lines of the check, I created this linen piping. This is just folded linen, and I inserted it in the seam. I also used that same folded linen as a finish for the armholes because this is a walking vest and it did not need sleeves. And then I just brought the lining up to cover the back side. I did the same treatment on the duster behind me. That's this one I call Autumn Patchwork. And I have, again, cording running up that same area to differentiate between the band, or in this case the collar, and the jacket body. This is one of my most favorite jackets I've ever made. I have worn it a ton. The interesting thing is when I wove the fabric, I didn't like it when it came off the loom. But you always get the opportunity with anything that's less than spectacular when you weave yardage to then make something spectacular with it. And this was a perfect example. I want to point out that I did put piping in here to really accent the princess seam, but it's not traditional piping. I actually hand felted and used the organic natural edge of that felted strip. I hand felted and then inserted into the seam piping that's actually hand felted. So you can see this natural edge here. This is actually a felt laminate because I actually felted that green to a piece of silk. And I just want to point out this green line here is actually couching, which I will cover in another video. So this little vest has a story. I worked on it for about 10 years. This is all hand beaded. I did bead lines with copper beads along the jacquard design on this piece of upholstery fabric. I'd put it aside for a while, and when I was going through breast cancer, almost 20 years ago, I ended up bringing it and all the little beads with me while I sat for hours going through chemo treatment. So I think of this as my chemo vest. I made a gown to go with it and since wore it when I stood for my mom and for my best friend at their weddings. So it got quite a bit of really nice use. But I wanted to point it out because the perimeter cording here is actually commercial. You can purchase commercial cording from places that sell upholstery supplies. It has a little bit of a seam allowance on it, and it can be set into, I will explain how when I actually talk about how to apply this stuff, but you can actually set it in and have a really nice corded edge with a commercial cording. And lastly, I'm going to show you this jacket. It's a shadow weave that I wove. And this is basically the jacket that I'm making out of hand-woven fabric. This one, unlike the Harris tweed on the form behind me, this one will have a band. And I'm going to put cording in that band, the same cording that will match the epaulette on the shoulder, which you may remember from a previous video. Here you can see how I've put cording into the band, the seam between the band and the jacket. And in this case, that cording will veer off and become button loops. Now that I'm going to cover in a different video, but I want to point out that I'm going to sort of reserve what I need for that as I'm constructing the piping for this particular jacket. This is actually what we're aiming for, and I'm going to show you how to do it. Let's talk about what to stuff piping with to make cording. I use a couple of different things. Whatever you use, it really should be washable and flexible. One of my favorite stuffings is a superwash wool or old-fashioned Lopi yarn, or even something like this Freedom wool from the UK. You'll want something that is fat and soft and will give a slightly rounded effect to the piping without being a heavier cord. Note that this Lopi or this Freedom wool isn't machine washable. There is a type of wool like this that is called superwash, but the kind of garments that I trim with cording that contain Lopi or something like this don't really get machine washed. They would be hand washed or dry cleaned, so that won't really affect the filler. My other favorite stuffing material is 1/8 inch cotton piping drapery cord. I got this from wowak.com on a 3-pound cone, but you might be able to find it by the yard in the home deck area of a big box fabric store. In any case, to make proper cording or stuffed piping, you'll need a good zipper foot, and this can be a bit of a challenge. If you use a vintage sewing machine, you should have no problem finding a zipper foot that makes great cording, probably already in your box. The key to success here is to be able to run the side of the foot along the seam line when creating the cording. Most of the newer machines come with a zipper foot that is pretty useless, in my opinion, for most tasks where you would want a zipper foot. I'll get into that in a minute. First, we need to talk about shanks. If you aren't a very experienced person who sews, see how I avoided saying the no longer acceptable sewer or even worse, sewist? If you aren't a very experienced person who sews, you might not understand that not all machines have the same shank. That's the part that the foot attaches to, and so not everything that you might find on eBay will fit your machine. Know your shank. There are 3 basic shank configurations. There's the short shank, there's the high shank, and then the Singer slant. And then there is Bernina. And then there's the old Bernina and the new Bernina. Now, since I don't own a Bernina, I can't say or show exactly what foot will give you what you need, but Bernina is famous for having a foot for every task. So Bernina owners should consult with your dealer to find out what foot is right for the task. Meanwhile, this is typical of a zipper foot that comes with newer machines. It has a wall that prevents getting in close for fatter things like cording, and this flange is just stupid. If you flip it over, there are grooves to allow the passing of zipper teeth, but for cording purposes, this is completely useless. My favorite zipper foot is the old-fashioned ski foot that slides on a perpendicular rail across the back, allowing you to fine-tune and position the edge of the ski foot right where you want it. Fortunately, Janome makes a short shank ski foot and a high shank ski foot, and I have both for each of my Janome machines because one takes a short shank foot and the other takes a high shank foot. And here is the typical Singer slant foot, which if you have any old Singer or Kenmore that you're working with, and a Kenmore that was made by Singer in the day, you probably have this foot in your box of parts. It's a treasure, hold on to it. But note that it only fits that machine. The point here is to know the shank of your machine before you just go out and get a ski-shaped zipper foot. Now that we have all that out of the way, let's get to constructing piping and cording. Start with a strip of bias, about 2 inches or 5 centimeters wide. Make sure the strip is long enough to do the job. I have covered cutting and piecing bias strips in a separate video. Sample, sample, sample. I always start with a short piece of bias and test the width that I want to ultimately show. Test whether I want piping or cording, and if cording, what kind of filler. I can't stress this enough. Any of the techniques that I cover in this YouTube series should be sampled first on scraps. Know what you and your equipment are doing and where you're going before you dive head first and find out there's no water in the pool. I always construct the piping or cording first before attaching it to the garment. It's so much more accurate and controllable. Piping is simply folding a strip of bias in half lengthwise. Pressing is optional, especially if you don't want a hard edge to the piping. Now, I always baste this step. I use my trusty piece of black electrical tape or the edge of my presser foot to help keep me consistent and accurate, and I will sew parallel to the fold the distance that I want to see in the finished garment. Creating cording is somewhat more challenging. Set the zipper foot so that the needle is right along the right edge of the foot as you look at it. You'll want the needle right along that edge here and not nestled into the notch in the foot. Fold the bias strip over the filler material. Nest the foot close to the side wall of the cording and begin basting. Once you've created your piping, it's time to attach it to the garment.